Good morning, welcome to our last campus seminar in this year. It's very nice that Brian McNoldy volunteered to give a seminar today about an interesting topic of hurricane names. And here's a little summary of his background. He got a bachelor's degree in physics and astronomy as a double major, plus a minor in mathematics at Lycoming College in Pennsylvania in 1998, and then a master's degree in atmospheric science at Colorado State University 2001. Then he was a research associate at the same place from 2001 to 2011, and he came here in 2012 as a senior research associate. He has a long CV, longer than some professors' CVs I have seen, that shows he is the author or co-author of 27 peer-reviewed publications. He has given approximately 55 presentations that are documented there. He also is involved in about 70 conference papers. He has received 7 awards, and he's a member of AGU, AMS, Sigma P Sigma, I'm not sure what that is, the American Physical Society and the American Institute of Physics. So it's an honor to have him here today, and he will talk about the names of tropical cyclones.
All right, thank you, Roland. Thank everyone for coming, both in person and online. I'm going to keep this kind of light, you know, at the end of the year, and then we're kind of all ready for something on the lighter side. So this is going to be a little, I have some parts of this that are a little bit interactive, so sorry for the Zoom people. Although if you can, I don't know if you'll be able to yell and we can hear you or not, but anyway, I'll get started here. So obviously the first question is, why do we name tropical cyclones? There are a few other things that are named, but generally when you think of a named storm, hurricanes are generally what comes to mind first. They're high impact, well-organized storms that are easy to track and typically last for several days. So those are kind of all important components of why you name something. If something only lasts a few minutes, by the time you come up with a name for it, it's already done happening. So you want something with a little bit of longevity to it. And then a distinctive name is easier, quicker, and less confusing. Rather than assigning it just a number or even coordinates, even worse, especially when there are multiple storms. And we generally start across the world, names are assigned to tropical cyclones when they reach tropical storm intensity, which is 34 knots or 39 mile per hour winds, which corresponds, those numbers seem somewhat picked out of the blue, but it actually is the start of the Beaufort Force 8, which is why these are traditionally called gales. That's what Beaufort Force 8 is the gale, which at sea is described as moderately high waves of greater length, edges of crest begin to break into spin drift. The foam is blown in well-marked streaks along the direction of the wind. That's the lower picture down there is from a ship in a low-end tropical storm conditions. And on land, this was kind of a funny one, I thought. Twigs break off trees, generally impede progress. Okay. This has a few gray zones of exactly when it started, but informally, Clement Bragg is generally credited with the first person to give tropical cyclones human-sounding names. Roughly in 1887. Again, depends on the source exactly, but generally around that time frame. He didn't really have a system exactly. He just sometimes he used Greek letters, sometimes he used figures from Greek mythology. He often used female names, which were described later dulcet names of the dusky beauties of the South Sea Islands. Later, he started to use names of politicians who he didn't especially like. That ended, though, when the Bureau of meteorology was formed in 1908, and then that was the end of naming tropical cyclones for 50-ish years around the world. Strange. Pre-roughly 1950, they weren't given human-sounding names. They were generally named after saints, or when they happened, or where they hit, that sort of thing. So there's obviously hundreds and hundreds of examples of these. I just listed a handful of them here.
Someone says he cannot hear you. Is the microphone
Oh, I don't know.
on? No, it's on. Maybe he has his... Can other...
Is there anyone else on Zoom?
Can other people in Zoom hear us? Can someone say something if they can hear us?
I can hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, guys. All right. So again, I just picked a few examples of some noteworthy hurricanes through the ages, and like I said, there's many, many hundreds more of these. But you can see they were often named after saints. Eventually, they got to be named after saints of, if there was a saint day that the hurricane occurred on, like San Bartolome was one that was named basically on the day that it hit, was that saint's day. But it's kind of scattered. The Great Hurricane of 1780, that was I believe probably still the deadliest hurricane in Atlantic history. And that's the only name it gets, is the Great Hurricane of 1780. Then, of course, there's some that you probably remember as we get down this list into, I would say, anyone who's casually aware of hurricane history knows about the Great Galveston Hurricane of 1900. That was an extremely impactful storm there. And if you're sitting here in the room or on Zoom, you really need to know about the Great Miami Hurricane of 1926, or if you're not, you are dismissed. And I have a few pictures tossed around here and there. So that picture down there in the lower right is a storm surge during the Great Miami Hurricane, and obviously not good. Great Okeechobee Hurricane. The Great Labor Day Hurricane is still the most intense hurricane to make U.S. landfall, and a Great New England Hurricane. Okay. So I promised Roland at the onset that this was not going to be just list after list and talking about lists of names, but this is the exception slide. So in 1947, they actually started to name tropical cyclones from the World War II phonetic alphabet. So the U.S. Air Force started that. So Able, Baker, Charlie, Dog, Easy, Fox. So they were just always just named that year after year. The U.S. Weather Bureau took over the naming after that in 1950, but they also used the same list, same phonetic alphabet. Then we kind of had this awkward history of different attempts at naming storms. The 1953 and 54, only 2 years, the U.S. Weather Bureau came up with just this list that was repeated. Again, that they didn't know in advance it would only be for 2 years, but that lasted only 2 years. Then you had a few years where you had unique lists, but there wasn't necessarily a repeating sequence to them. Turned out they didn't need it to be repeating because that practice also ended eventually. But notice so far that once you got out of the phonetic alphabet, all female names, and then here in 1960, for 11 years, we have 4 rotating lists of all female names. And this is where the transition from the U.S. Weather Bureau to the National Hurricane Center happened. I guess the other thing worth pointing out is they were always alphabetical too, which actually is not the case in the West Pacific. So it's not, don't take that for granted. In the West Pacific, they just rotate through names. They don't need to be in any particular order. So they are alphabetical order in the Atlantic. 1971 switched to 10 rotating lists of female names. It didn't even last that long, so they never got through all their intended pre-planned lists. And then this one's covered up for me, but we know 1979 is where we transitioned to the modern naming system that we still use today, where we have 21 names alternating male-female for the first time, and then each year you alternate if it starts with a female or also starts with a male name. So you kind of the A name is female, male, female, male from one year to the next. And so the very first male name given to a tropical cyclone in the Atlantic was Bob. And that was on July 10th, 1979. And of course, this was a very, very male-centric field. So, which is largely why all the names previously were all female names. And I'm going to guess that that had some influence on how the very first male name was described in the storm report. It was a well-behaved storm, so that warnings and forecasts were exceptionally good. Of course. So anyway, that's where we are now for lists. Now this I left blank to begin with because this is going to be an interactive one, a little bit. So if you, like I said in the previous slide, there's 21 names in the list. Okay, well what happens if you have a really active season that you run into the end of the list? Then what do you do? Well, we know now that there are auxiliary lists that you just jump to. So this modern naming system started in 1979. When do you think a plan came about for the Atlantic to have this overflow list? 1979, anyone?
2005.
Good guess, very good guess. And you're on the right track, if that gives anyone a hint. Okay. Well, it was on the track because it was a very active season, but rewind 10 years to 1995, which was another hyperactive season, and that season ended up just 2 letters short of running out of names. And they're like, uh-oh. So fortunately, it wasn't really needed because there was nothing in the plan, the National Hurricane Operation Plan, at the time to go into an overflow list. So this meeting convenes the spring after a hurricane season. So in 1996, the spring of 96, that's when they finally decided, oh, we should have an overflow list for the Atlantic. And they chose the Greek alphabet as that list, which of course aren't names, it's an alphabet. That becomes a problem. The East Pacific already had that in place for the same reason, that they almost ran into trouble one year of running out of names, like, uh-oh, we don't know what to do. So that was kind of a default thing of, okay, let's use the Greek alphabet in the Atlantic too. But I was surprised to learn that when I was looking through every one of the hurricane operation plans year after year, trying to hunt down when this escape plan came into being, and it was only in 1996. But here's where 2005 comes in. It didn't actually get put into place until 2005, when 6 storms formed after Wilma at the end. So that was the first advisory there on October 22nd. List of names is exhausted. We will utilize the Greek alphabet should the depression reach tropical storm strength. The first name on this list is Alpha. And of course, it did. Then 2020, which is much more fresh in our memories. 9 storms formed after Wilfred. So we had 30 named storms that year. It was basically like 2 hurricane seasons crammed into one. 2 of those 9 were very impactful, and they deserved to have their names retired, but they couldn't retire a letter. Like that, this doesn't make sense. That you can't retire the letter B. We generally retire names that start with B. So that became the issue there. So in that subsequent meeting the next spring, they did technically retire those 2 Greek letters, but then they also decided that the whole alphabet system was flawed because of that reason, and some other reasons too. Some people, a lot of the Greek letters like eta, beta, theta, zeta, that didn't go over real well in popular culture. It was very confusing. So I think that was another reason for just ending the Greek alphabet completely. And so they came up with this new auxiliary list on the right, and that's the one that we have in place now, which has not been needed yet. But those are retirable now. Like you could retire any one of those and replace them with another name. Okay. So how do they get retired? This always feels like some process that takes place in a smoky room and people with white wigs sit around and make grand decisions. It's not really what it is, but it feels like that to me. So there is a committee, and it's part of the WMO, World Meteorological Organization. There are regions around the world. So region 4 is that North American, Central American one. 28 member nations send people to this meeting every spring. It's usually March, April. And it's a multi-day meeting, so it's not like the whole point of it is to discuss retirement, but that's one agenda item on one day. And so someone can put up a storm name to say, I think this should be retired, and here's why, and everyone chats about it and says, yes, we agree, let's retire it, or nah, that wasn't that bad. I think generally if someone has a reason to bring it up for nomination, there's probably a good reason. Of course, if it's retired, you have to pick a new name to replace it, and it's very subjective. There are no check boxes to check, or how much did it destroy, or how many people did it kill. None of that matters. And I'll show examples of that. So this will be a little bit full of numbers here, but it's just kind of, I know for the real hurricane nerds out there, this is fun. So we're about 900 named storms going back to 1953 when we have these, since names have been retired. So that averages out to, or the number of storms averages out to about 12.7 per year, almost 13 storms per year. Huge range. We've had as few as 4 and as many as 30. Of course, that was in 2020, like I just said. We're at 96 names have been retired now. So that works out to almost 11% of all named storms end up being retired. And a large, vast majority of storms that ended up being retired were Category 3 plus hurricanes, or major hurricanes. So 85% of all retired storms were Category 3 plus. So pretty good odds. And if there is a major hurricane out there, somewhere in the Atlantic, you got an almost 50-50 shot of it ended up getting retired. So generally they're very impactful. Not surprisingly, I suppose. So why retire them? I guess that's a good question to answer while we're here. There's no reason you couldn't just come up with names of lists and just keep reusing them. But they, long ago, basically since the naming process came about, they also realized some names people don't want to hear again. Like it was very impactful and it reminds them of it, that sort of thing. Whereas some names come and go. We've had them 8 times and no one cares, no one remembers, so what if you use it again? So they generally say that their actual reason written out, at the request of any member state, if it requires special notoriety because of human loss or injuries or damage or other impacts or other special reasons. So, just basically impactful for some reason. And if it's retired, it's replaced with a name of the same, obviously it has to be replaced with the name that starts with the same first letter, and also the same gender of names, so you keep the male-female alternating sequence going true. Language of origin is kind of in there in the mix, as I understand it, because generally around the world, storm names are generally chosen to represent the countries that they affect. So in the Atlantic, we generally don't have Japanese or Vietnamese names, but in the West Pacific, they sure do. In the Atlantic, we generally are English, Spanish, French, and so on. Those 3 ethnicities of names pretty much encompass probably 98% of all the names on the list. I'm going to just zip through these quick. They're just maps of the storms that have been retired. Okay, tropical storm, pretty sparse map here. Does anyone know who these 2 are? Oh, the only 2 tropical storms that have ever had their names retired.
Is it Irma?
Allison and Erica?
Yes, Allison and Erica. And why would a tropical storm get retired?
Floods.
Yeah, rain, exactly. Rain is a big deal for hurricanes, and it kind of gets overlooked. And then category 1, you'll see these kind of, more and more. Now we get into category 3s, definitely getting a little more crowded. Category 4s, a whole lot more crowded. Category 5, a little less crowded. Why do you suppose that is?
There's are fewer.
Bingo, there are fewer of them. So, historically, about 2% of Atlantic tropical cyclones become category 5. So, yeah, this is the top of the top. And then all of them thrown together is just a mess. It's like a box of crayons melted. Okay, so this is another interactive question. This is going to be, what letter has been the most retired? I. We have a winner in the crowd here. Any guess of what's number 2? No. F. But I is by far number 1 with so far 13. And the reason I asked what number 2 is because commonly people assume that I is by far the most retired because that's maybe approximately when the peak of the hurricane season is. But that doesn't answer why H and J are not even close. If that's the case, why would F be? So I think it's just luck. Really, it comes down to a lot. I mean, I guess the time of year roughly has something to do with it, but picking I out of H and J, that's just luck. And to kind of showcase that, this is what the seasonal activity looks like, averaged over 1953 to 2003. And then I wrote down the dates of when when that main storm forms. So over that 71-year period, the A storm on average forms June 23rd, so on. So I, in this time period, forms on September 23rd. So that's forms on September 23rd. It's not when it would be doing its action. So yeah, you don't get a lot from that. I guess that's kind of the point of, I wanted to include that on here because I don't think it's the peak of hurricane season or reason. I think it just came down to really bad luck sometimes with I. It's kind of like this thing now. Every time there's an I storm that looks like it's going to be strong, everyone cringes. The number of names is trending upward. Number of retired names is trending upward. Kind of interesting. 2005 wins this one with 5 names retired from that year. By peak intensity, this is not very surprising or interesting. Of course, this looks exactly like what you'd expect. The category 3, as we saw in the maps, category 4, and then category 5 drops down because there are many fewer of them. But the odds are really good that they'd end up getting retired. This one looks exactly like the curve of activity across the Atlantic. So the month of peak intensity, very uninteresting. It looks like what this season looks like. This is an interesting one. Now, notice the y-axis is on a log scale here to really kind of show the spread of numbers. But this is, how many people are killed by tropical cyclones over this time period? And I actually did do a trend line through this, and it's flat. I didn't even put it on here, but it's flat. So that's a little troubling, I guess, because you would expect that things are improving. Anyone have an idea of maybe why? Okay, we know forecasts are improving since 1953. There's no one questions that. So why are we not seeing a decline in the number of fatalities?
Compensations.
What was that?
Compensations. There's more people.
Yep. Yeah, we're just moving into harm's way. basically. There's more and more people moving to coasts. So even though forecasts are getting more accurate, there's more of us exposing ourselves to the hazard. This is economic losses, also trending upward. And these are all inflation adjusted, so this is comparing apples to apples. Again, same reason, not only more people getting, or we're not seeing a decline necessarily in the number of fatalities, but economic losses, which are things that can't move out of the way when a hurricane comes, that's going up. We're putting more stuff in harm's way. Now, this is interesting. There's a kind of a decent list of storms that have not been retired, but by any means you can think of, they should have been, especially this first one. This was the deadliest of any non-retired named storm. So, and this is, there's an exact number assigned to it, but it's actually not exact. So let's say in the ballpark of 1,200 deaths, which is really a lot for any tropical cyclone. And that did not warrant its retirement. That seems strange. What does it take then? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then on the other end of this is, okay, 2020 we had Hurricane Sally, which only caused 4 deaths, which, as tropical cyclones go, is not that bad, but very expensive. The costliest of any non-retired name. So it's not costs or deaths that cause a storm to be retired, which we generally think of being the case. This one is really bizarre. So Gordon, obviously, occurred in 1994. At that Hurricane Committee meeting in 1995, the area that was hardest hit by Gordon, where most of these deaths came from, was in Haiti, and due to a lot of rainfall and flash flooding and all that. Well, Haiti didn't end up sending a representative to that meeting in 1995. So no one else thought it should be nominated, apparently. And I wish I could have been a fly on the wall in that meeting. But no one nominated it for retirement, so it just didn't get retired. So, storm that killed about 1,200 people is still on the books. Still getting used. Really amazing. And that just goes to show you how subjective this is. And like I said, I can't imagine that no one else would have thought of suggesting it, even though Haiti's representative wasn't there. So this is kind of a fun look at the original 6 lists. That's the list that we still use. Some of them are gone. So all the ones in red have since been retired. So they're some of them many times over. But the ones in red have all been retired. The ones in blue and red have all been used at least once. But there's only 6 names that we've never had in the Atlantic. Virginia, Walter, Valerie, William, Van, and Wendy. We've never had a tropical storm with those names. So sorry, Van, wherever you are out there. One of these years, your time will come. So this is another one. Some of these slides I bring up because I get so many questions each year about each of these subtopics. So it just seems like it's an easy slide to come up with of well, this is what people are asking about. So here you go. These one-off names, things that they were retired on their very first time on the list. And the first 4 kind of cheat because that's the first time that the lists were put in place. So David, Frederick, Allen, and Alicia, okay, they were retired because that was their first time. But then there's only been 4 others. Michelle, after Marilyn, Ike, Igor, and Irma are the only 4 that kind of had this first time on the list. Yup, you're out. And as we just talked about, Gordon should be the 5th one in that little list there because Gilbert in 1988 was retired, and then Gordon in 94 should have been retired. So, this past year we had 2 new names on the list, Francine and Milton. They replaced Florence and Michael from 2018. Will either of those get added? I would say probably not Francine, and Milton has a decent chance. We'll see what that mysterious smoke-filled room has to say in March or April. And then this is really getting into the nitty-gritty of lists, but it's interesting because we can consider what 2024 is going to do to it. This is just since 1979 with our modern name list. So 2 of the lists, including list 5, which were on this year, we used list 5, and list 2, which would have been 1980, 1986, so on and so on, have had 14 names retired from them. And you compare that to list 4, which had 6. Now, intuitively, I would think these would kind of just be randomly distributed, but they're not even close. That's a big difference. So, again, probably luck is involved, but that's really amazing to have a 6 thrown in there. The rest of these are kind of in the noise level. So only once has a letter from a given list been retired 3 times, and that just happened after Ian. So, but the reason this is kind of neat now for 2024, I think I lost my cursor here. But list 5 with the 14, if Milton gets retired, this list is up to 15, and it also makes the second 3 entry on here. Let's see. Yeah, a little tidbit that's fun. I has been retired the most, as we heard, and the only letter that has been retired at least once from every list is F. So, I'm going to wrap up here and take some questions. So, the practice of naming tropical cyclones is relatively new, about 70 years, and we name them when it reaches tropical storm intensity. The practice of retiring them roughly coincides. Didn't take long to realize that people did not like certain names being reused. Improved forecasts help to offset more people and more stuff in harm's way. So, we are seeing more retired storms, and we are seeing higher economic costs, but the number of fatalities is not decreasing. So we're kind of keeping up with it. we're putting more people there, and these storms keep happening, but we're more aware of them and what the forecast is for them. So as storm surge warnings improve and track forecasts and all that stuff that goes into helping people evacuate or prepare is certainly good, but there's just more of us on the coast now. And it's just a very subjective thing. So you can have a season that could have 8 named storms in it, and 3 of them could end up being extremely impactful, and you could have 3 retired names out of a quiet hurricane season. You have that kind of luck component of if it strikes a populated area or a rural area. Florida's a great example. We have parts of the state that are very sparsely populated, and the hurricane can make landfall there as a Category 4, and I mean, obviously for the people that live there, it's very impactful, but in terms of numbers of people, it's not very many. Again, this is where the forecast skill comes in. You're not going to have the fatalities as high if people can evacuate or find shelter. It can be a less expensive storm economically if infrastructure is more resilient. So even if a hurricane hits you, there's less to rebuild and less to do everything because you were able to build in a resilient way from the start. So it really, there are no objective guidelines. There's no magic number of this many people or this much cost. It just comes down to nominating and voting. And it's an interesting practice, this ritual of retiring names. It's not just, was it an active hurricane season or how many major storms did you get? Those numbers don't really matter so much. So it's an intersection of nature, psychology, economics, and societal vulnerability that kind of all just glue together to come up with this ritual of retiring names. Oh, and thanks to Dan Brown and Gary Padgett, who gave some historical insights throughout this. And I believe that is the end. Yeah. So, all right, I'll take any questions.
Okay, very nice. Thank you very much. Who has questions in the room? I will come with you with my microphone for the Zoom people. Brian?
Regarding Gordon, didn't your WMO language say a member state has to nominate, but any member state could, or it had to be the member state?
I guess I don't know. Maybe someone online. I see Richard Pash is online. He could be more qualified to answer that than I am.
Well, yeah, I believe any member state can nominate.
Okay.
And the Gordon case is very weird because, it really was not near the landfall location there in Haiti, and it was just something very bizarre. Most unfortunate, of course, the tremendous loss of life, but it just didn't show up, like even at the satellite imagery, that there was much going on there in Haiti. It's not clear why so many people died, but clearly could be looked into some more. Since I'm on, I might add that there was at least one other name retired for other reasons. There was a name in the East Pacific, Adolf, that was retired a number of years ago for obvious reasons.
All right. Thanks, Richard.
Abhishek was first, I think.
Thank you, Brian. I have a question about, you mentioned the fertility rate is not going down, it is increasing. My question, although we are better doing forecast, so what is missing there? You think is still the information is not reaching to the society, or we are not able to forecast in advance so they have time to prepare for the damage? What is missing? Like, how can we improve this damage or fertility rate? Where we need to work on to be better prepared in the future. Thank you.
So, yeah, your question is just why are we not really seeing the number of fatalities drop? And it's just, you would think. I guess it depends on people's response. Even if there are perfect forecasts, there are still going to be people who either choose to or can't evacuate, or aren't prepared, that sort of thing. It's there's just some things that you can't make happen even when you know the information. And so just by putting more and more, like since 1953, there's certainly significantly more people living along the coastlines. So it's just kind of an odds game at that point, that if you have a significant hurricane with a 12-foot storm surge somewhere, and some fraction of the population either chooses not to or can't evacuate, that's where those numbers come from. Or it could be a significant inland rainfall event like we had this season.
Do you know if there's any relationship between where a storm does the most damage and how likely the name is to be retired? Like with the Gordon example specifically, I imagine they couldn't send a representative because they were using much of their resources to recover from the damage of the storm. Whereas in the U.S., if we had a similarly damaging storm, we would probably still be able to send someone. Is there any relationship there, or is that just kind of an anomaly?
I would guess that there's probably not, and that some of this gets tricky because a storm can be impactful in a few countries. It doesn't even have to make landfall somewhere in its entire life. It just has to get close enough to dump a ton of rain or do something like that. So I think it's a little hazy, I guess.
To you.
Do you know if there are any explanations for why, I think it was the fourth
No, not that I'm aware. It's just, I think, really, I mean, unless there's some very strange, unknown 6-year oscillation or something that spikes down, it's just, yeah, it really is. You can go back to that, and it's just, it really stands out. You know, like 11, 12, and 14 all seem like fine. You would expect that number to be like 10 or, you know, whatever, some number in that ballpark. So no, I don't know that there's any reason other than just luck.
So do you have any examples, I guess, that come to mind of like the inverse of the Gordon case? Going back to the idea of how subjective and very like tolerant of any recommendation of retirement this decision process is. Are there any cases you can think of which are like, no, well, I guess it's retired now. That just like were a little confusing to you?
Yeah. So this one was kind of, it's hard to get lower than this. So Hurricane Paloma was retired, and that killed one person. You know, so yeah, there's a gigantic. Well, the range is 1 to about 12,000. Again, that number is not a definitive number. It's about 12,000 because lots of people were still missing. So huge range, and even 1 is enough to do it.
Paloma was tiny, right?
Yeah, and yeah. For anyone who doesn't remember Paloma, that was a tiny. It was a Category 4 hurricane, if I remember correctly, that made landfall in Cuba.
Any more questions from here? No? Anybody in Zoom wants to ask something? Turn your microphone on and just ask.
Or some chats.
Nothing.
Oh, let's see. Yeah, there's. Are there any questions on chat?
Can you read them
Let
on
me
your
see.
screen? And repeat them?
Yeah, let me get it open here. Here, okay.
I think there were more comments or
Yeah.
things that were already answered by someone else in the chat.
No, I don't see any outstanding questions. I think everything was just kind of fun chat.
Okay, then thank you, Brian, for the nice presentation. Thank you all for coming. Come again in January when we continue with Compass. We'll not have Christmas cookies anymore, so take another Christmas cookie today on your way out.
Or if you don't take them all, they'll still be left over.